Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
The report in America into Donald Trump's abuse of power is damning, but of course it will be completely ignored by people who like him. And that it is, I guess, today's entry into the great issue of our time, which is, of course, Well, I've been thinking a bit about it. Bear with me on this one, all right? This idea that people like being lied to, I worry sometimes that we don't learn from our mistakes. And by we, I mean people who like their politics evidence-based, you know. And you look at Brexit and you sort of think, well, it doesn't work. I always think back to a call from about 10 years ago, which at the time was just hilarious. Now it feels like a canary down the coal mine. You can prove anything with facts, James, she said. And we all chuckled. Now we seem to be living in a world where facts have achieved a sort of derisory status. They're worth roughly the same as the opposite of facts, which are, of course, lies. Although, as Kellyanne Conway, Donald Trump's consigliere, chose to call them not too long ago, alternative facts. It's all there if you can find the energy and the inclination to join the dots. That as soon as you have the White House describing lies as alternative facts, you have very little difficulty in understanding everything that has followed. But rather than just lob brickbats at the victims of these cons, you perhaps some mornings feel an urge to step a little further into the story or to dig a little deeper into the phenomenon. In this case, I think a psychological rather than a political phenomenon. But people like being lied to. I like being lied to because it upsets the other lot. It upsets you. You know, I'm obsessed with this mindset at the moment, partly because I'm writing about it. But it's more than that, isn't it? Because what needs to be in place before people can actually relish being lied to? What needs to happen first? I have this sort of odd obsession with trying to... You know how some kids like to take lawnmowers apart and put them back together? I was not that kid, all right? I once took a bicycle to pieces and put it back together, tooled out of the front gate, pulled a wheelie, wheel fell off, and I spent probably the most terrifying 90 seconds of my life trying to keep her upright just on the back wheel. And I was actually quite good at wheelies back in the day. I could go up and down the road on one wheel. But when your front wheel has fallen off and bounced down the road, I presume it does something to the balance of the bicycle on the one hand, but it also does something to the balance of your mind on the other hand, because you spend a significant amount of time wondering, what happens when I stop this wheelie? I've got no front wheel. If I go backwards... that's going to hurt. If I go forwards, which is what actually happened, and the front fork just split like a ballerina's leap, and well, I've still got a scar just below my right eyebrow. Thank you for asking. I'll be all right. Why was I talking about that? So it upsets the balance of your mind, and it upsets the balance of your the sort of physical side of things. But I like not to dismantle bicycles and put them back together, but I like to try, with your help, some days when we're feeling chipper, to dismantle a position and then put it back together to work out how it started. So if you're trying to work out how we've ended up in a place where people like being lied to, okay, and I don't know which lie you want to choose. Pick your own. Yesterday it was the repeated claim by the President of the United States of America that he'd predicted Brexit while in Scotland, despite not arriving in Scotland until the day after Brexit. It's just so barefaced that it almost beggars belief that people would still try to flog it. But here we are. So what has to happen before people like being lied to? Okay, before people are prepared to pretend they believe a lie? It's a complete breakdown of trust. Now, this might be a tiny bit chicken and egg, but if you don't really feel that you can trust any politician, then you're free to sort of holler your support for the ones who you just sort of like, or the ones that you've been led to believe might somehow represent your interests, even though you've got no evidence to support that position. We conducted a lovely phone-in a couple of weeks ago, about a month ago, I think, asking a very simple question, which was, in the case of Boris Johnson, for example, what is it from his past, either political, professional or personal, that you would cite as evidence of his trustworthiness or even evidence of his effectiveness? And I mean, to say that the pickings were slim would be something of an understatement. The poor fellow who rang in to claim that he was a great champion of gay rights. Had something of a nightmare that day, what with the comments about tank top bum boys and what have you. But it stayed with me, that, because I did find myself thinking, as we surveyed the unfolding landscape of this general election, that trust doesn't seem to matter anymore, does it? That's really weird. Because if you're saying, I like being lied to because it winds up the other lot, you're saying that I don't care, I don't trust them, I just like them. And then we come to the NHS, and I could be over-egging this particular pudding, but I don't know where we are supposed to turn to get a clear steer on whether or not any future trade deal with America would necessarily entail the NHS being on the proverbial table. That thing about facts and alternative facts, again, is perfectly highlighted here, because Trump has stated that it categorically will be, and he's stated categorically that it won't be. So you can choose, according to what scarf you've got around your neck, which of those two statements from the same man you believe. Trust has got nothing to do with it, has it? How can you trust him when he says it won't be on the table if he's also said that it will be on the table? And I suppose people that don't like his peculiar brand of bigoted white supremacism would squabble with the word trust, because you've ended up, without realising it, trusting him when he says it will be on the table. Oh, I believe him then when he says that. And the other lot, mostly people who are comfortable with his peculiar brand of bigoted white supremacism, would argue that they trust him when he says it's not on the table. Do they actually believe him when he says that, or I don't know. And for this morning's purposes, I'm not sure that I care particularly, because what I want you to tell me, and I know I'm going to come a cropper one of these days when I arrogantly presume that the people listening to this programme are better qualified to genuinely illuminate the bigger issues of the day than the people who are mostly paid to do so. The question then becomes, who can we trust on this? So you know that Dominic Raab co-authored a pamphlet which argued that I think 2/3 of NHS hospitals would be better off operating privately. You may know that Matt Hancock, the current Health Secretary, took some £32,000 in donations from a Lord High Panjandrum at a, quotes, educational charity called the Institute of Economic Affairs, which has argued frequently for privatisation within the health service. He's now the Health Secretary. But you also know that both Boris Johnson and Matt Hancock insist severally and repeatedly, and indeed I think Dominic Raab tried to do so yesterday, that the NHS is not in any way up for sale. Now, you and me probably don't even know what that phrase means. Simplistic slogans running politics actually ends up infecting all of us, even those of us who think that we are, I suppose, at best an antidote to simplistic slogans and at worst simply too clever to fall for them. We're not. We all fall for them eventually. What does up for sale mean? You know? I don't know what that means. Does it mean they're going to put for sale signs outside the Royal Free? I mean, almost certainly not. So what does it mean? Well, it means that private companies will be able to undertake to provide things that are currently provided by nationalised interests. But that already happens. You can, if you look hard enough, already see logos on the sides of NHS ambulances that reveal the private sector provenance of that particular ambulance. And services within hospitals are also now undertaken by private companies, right up and down the country. I don't know. This is not my field of expertise, but I know that I don't think that I've said anything inaccurate so far. So what does it mean, the phrase, the NHS is on the table or the NHS is up for sale? The Labour Party, of course, indulge in similarly simplistic slogans, but from the other side of the coin, they will tell you that it is. And the Conservatives will tell you that it isn't. And then the Labour Party will tell you that it is on the table, and the Conservatives will tell you that it isn't on the table. Where does that leave you? Probably, I think, in the same place that it leaves me. A little bit confused. And also confused about my confusion, because I've been engaging in this argument without actually knowing what the words mean. What does that simple phrase mean? The NHS is on the table. You probably know if you work in the sector, and I don't just mean the health sector, I also mean the health insurance sector, and I also mean the investment sector. What does it mean? And I find it hard to believe that one of the hugest recipients of money in this country would not in some way be part of a trade agreement which is supposed to plug at least a few of the enormous holes that will be left in our economic model after Brexit. I just can't quite say. I mean, what are we supposed to tempt them with? I think, as things stand, we're going to have to show quite a lot of leg to American trade negotiators in order to, and I don't even think we're in a position to argue to secure what we want. If Brexit goes ahead, then the negotiating team are, particularly if they're the Conservatives, I think they're going to be desperate to sign anything. And I don't quite see, from where I'm sitting, which is a very, very amateurish perspective, I don't quite see how we could say, oh, no, that goose over there, that fatted calf, that golden goose over there, that money-munching machine that we call the National Health Service, you can't go near that, lads. But I couldn't prove it to you. So whose opinion should we trust on these matters? 0345 6060 973. That's a very roundabout way of saying, can I trust yours? Do you actually know? So whether you're coming at it from health, from trade, from investment, or from insurance, who do you trust when it comes to this question of whether or not the NHS will somehow be subject to further privatisation? And I think it's fair to say that if that happens, the less you've got, the more you'll suffer. Or at least the more you've got, the more you'll benefit. Hit the numbers now, you will get through. 0345 6060 973. What does that simple phrase mean? The NHS is up for sale, or the NHS is on the table. And how do we know who we should trust when it comes to the question of whether or not it is actually on the table, stroke up for sale? What is the default position of the sanctimonious virtue signallers covering British politics today? Well, I think it's very important to admit your own ignorance. And I suddenly realised I don't really know what it means when people talk about the NHS being for sale or not being for sale, which is an astonishing admission, right up until the point when you realise that I don't think all the politicians wanging on from one side or the other do either. So do you? 0345 6060 973. And, of course, who can we trust when half the world tells us it is and half the world tells us it isn't? And Donald Trump, of course, characteristically tells us that it is and it isn't. George is in Manchester. George, what would you like to say?
Morning, James.
Hello,
First time caller.
You're very welcome. Where have you been all my life?
Well, just listening to all the political radio stations.
All right, I was only a bit of banter. I didn't expect a cuss. Carry on.
I'm joking. No, I just wanted to ring in, and I spoke to the girls on the line just that I've worked in the NHS as a frontline clinician, and I've worked in the private sector.
Yeah.
And now I work in medical product sales, selling into the NHS.
Okay.
So I've had a fairly...
you are quite well qualified then to comment on the question that I'm asking today as it goes.
I mean, I'm pretty sure there's more qualified, but I'll do my best.
Yes.
And yes, this phrase of the NHS is for sale, and the reason politicians band it around is just because it's simple.
Yes, of course.
The actual complexity of the NHS going up for sale is far beyond what most people can comprehend and want to actually research.
Well, that's the point, and not just people, but I suspect most of the politicians bandying it around as well couldn't tell you what it really means, but we've created a world, for good or for ill, in which that doesn't seem to matter anymore. Yeah,
I think that's pretty accurate. I think you've kind of hit the nail on the head, but in the sense that the NHS isn't for sale. It isn't an asset. It isn't a building or a painting. It's a huge collection of services that are tendered out to different providers.
Yes.
And for the most part, it's tendered out to the NHS. Obviously, there's an increase in privatisation where these services are being tendered out to Virgin Healthcare, or in my particular field at the minute, selling surgical products, we're seeing an increasing number of NHS patients being sent to private hospitals to deal with waiting lists.
Right.
And this notion that it's being sold is...
No, that's a really interesting example, isn't it? Because a private hospital is making a profit out of healthcare and health provision, but it is doing so in a way that actually reduces the burden on the non-private hospitals, on the NHS, because, as you say, it's done to reduce waiting lists, and money makes its way into the pockets of investors, but not in a way that is obviously and egregiously evil or wrong.
No, you're right. It's an interesting dynamic from that point in terms of what's currently happening with waiting lists. But I think the threat to the NHS, in quotations, being up for sale at the minute is that at some point that will stop being free.
Yes.
You can only sell so many NHS services to private companies before eventually someone has to start picking up the bill. So as far as I'm aware, the NHS still have to pay the private hospitals the tariffs that they would usually receive. Yes. I may be slightly wrong on that.
No, but or there'll be a fixed rate. I mean, I don't know how it works, but yes, some of that money, it has to be a finite process. At some point, there's nothing left to sell. But I suppose to zone in then, in the light of what you've said on the question, how feasible is it that any future trade agreement with America, or at least that any future trade negotiations with America wouldn't see American negotiators hoping to provide American investors with an opportunity to make money out of the health service in a way that they currently can't?
Well, I think it's completely unrealistic to suggest they wouldn't.
Right.
Completely unrealistic.
That was my fear.
They wouldn't. Yeah, it is. I mean, you've had Donald Trump coming out only 6 months ago saying everything will be on the table in a trade agreement, NHS included.
Yes.
He's come out yesterday and said, well, actually, no, we wouldn't take it if it was handed on a silver platter.
Yes, but don't forget, he is the honestest man in politics.
I was just about to say, between him and Boris, you could probably make, several dictionaries worth of lies that they've told. So,
I don't know what you mean by that. Boris Johnson is a man of is a man of impeccable consistency. In fact, here he is proving it.
I have to say, when Donald Trump says that there are parts of London that are no-go areas, I think he's betraying a quite stupefying ignorance that makes him, frankly, unfit to hold the office of President of the United States.
Oh, I don't know where that came from. Carry on, George.
No, I completely agree with you, and you're right. In any post-Brexit negotiations, particularly if it's Conservative-led and we may leave with what is considered a poor deal or no deal,
yes.
Like you said, we are going to have to show a bit of leg. And at the minute, the NHS protects us in the sense that it has caps on pharmaceutical prices.
Yes.
And you can absolutely bet your bottom dollar the Conservatives have got a track record of privatising any national infrastructure they can get their hands on. Mail, the utility companies, energy, water. If they can privatise it for a quick profit, they'll do it. People aren't going to wake up one day and suddenly NHS is gone, the logo is gone, and you're being provided.
But we wouldn't even make a profit out of adopting American licensing regulations on medicine patents.
I mean a profit for them.
Yes. Well, yeah, but that's why I hate it when people do this. You put me in a position now where I defend the politicians who privatised all the institutions you described, because that did raise money for the Treasury, you see, didn't it? Okay, you privatised something that the government or the country owns, whether it's flogging off council houses. There's money coming in, but there wouldn't be any actual money coming into the Treasury, short-term or long-term, if we simply said, all right, we'll adopt your licences now because we're so desperate for a trade agreement.
Yeah, that's a fair point.
It's still privatisation, but it's without the silver lining of the temporary injection of cash into the nation's coffers.
Yeah.
Oh dear, it's not a pretty picture you paint, George, is it?
Try not to be too pessimistic.
Well, we can't be too pessimistic. If we were too pessimistic, we'd probably draw attention to the column that Boris Johnson wrote for The Spectator in 1995, in which he said that people should be charged to use the National Health Service to prevent free care being abused by people who can afford to pay.
Well,
we can't all be held to the things that we did in 1995, George.
Well, no.
Is there any circumstance, knowing what you know, doing what you do, doing what you've done, that we could conduct a trade negotiation that is, epoch-defining in a post-Brexit Britain that didn't have the NHS in any way involved? I can't see it myself, but I'm hoping you'll say, I can just, if I squint a bit.
Yeah, potentially. I suppose it's a little bit on my remit, transatlantic trade agreements, but it depends what type of Brexit you get. If you have a close alignment to the EU that doesn't have as much economic damage, you may be in a position where you can say, well, actually, we don't need to sell off parts of the NHS.
Do you know the point people miss, and the point we've missed, actually, is that one of the few actually cogent campaigning positions that Donald Trump adopted when he was running to be President of the United States of America was, I don't think that he was being honest when he said that his motivation was cheaper medicines for Americans, because I don't think he cares personally about that. But his argument was that we could have cheaper medicines for Americans if we made other countries pay more for American pharmaceuticals. He literally campaigned on that platform. Yeah. And now he's asking us to believe that somehow we'd be exempt from that campaigning pledge.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. I don't know how many politicians you have to, particularly Conservative politicians, have to write books and pamphlets and information articles about how to privatise a healthcare system. So people wake up and say, well, actually, these guys might actually want to privatise the healthcare system.
That is a phrase that is going to stay with me. In fact, with your permission, George, I suspect I'll be passing it off as my own by tea time. How many books and pamphlets do they have to write calling for the privatisation of the NHS? How much money do they have to take from people who routinely call for the privatisation of the NHS before we all conclude that they might actually be interested in the privatisation of the NHS? Final question, George. Who do you trust? And I guess no one is an acceptable answer on this.
Yeah, I mean, I have to be honest. I trust the Labour Party. Anyone who's a left-wing leaning socialist party quite clearly agree with the principle of free at the point of access healthcare.
But in terms of Trump says it's on the table, isn't on the table, Labour say it is. I mean, that's a blind trust in Labour, with respect.
Yeah, I think there's certain pages of the UK-US trade agreement that actually state that the US do want access to all markets, including the NHS.
Yeah, I know.
So that's not the same as saying it's for sale, but I think, as Labour points out,
it's on the table. That's the point, isn't it? Something on the table doesn't necessarily stay on the table by the end of negotiations, but it's on the table at the beginning.
Yeah, and you'd be stupid to think that they won't fight tooth and nail for some kind of access to NHS markets. I trust the Labour Party. Whether or not it will be done to the scale they're saying, I'm a bit more sceptical.
Okay, so that's one for the Labour position. Of course, if you want to defend Donald Trump's position on this, you have to decide before you call him whether you're defending his position when he said it was on the table or whether you're defending his position when he said it wasn't on the table, which is kind of evidence that he's made something of a monkey out of you, but I've got a sneaking suspicion you probably aren't ready to admit that yet. We're talking about the privatisation of the NHS with the rather odd caveat, stroke admission, that we're not entirely sure what that means. Isn't it funny? You just lift the lid, have a little look under the bonnet of political debate, and it seems to me we're still labouring under the appalling affliction of using words without asking what they mean. I first noticed it in the context of control, when people started talking about taking back control and controlling our money and our borders and our laws, and no one asked which money or what laws or how we currently can't control our borders or who makes the decision. And, of course, that didn't get nipped in the bud. We let people, very dishonest and disreputable people, march up and down the country claiming that we can't control our money, our borders and our laws. And because journalists failed to challenge that or to make these people determine and define precisely what they meant by those words, they infected the mainstream of public discourse. So much so now that you hear them tripping off the tongues of very, very senior politicians all the way to the very top. We need to take back control of our money, our borders and our laws. And no one has ever asked them to explain how and what they mean. Incredible. And I think the same is probably true about the NHS now. Are you in favour of the privatisation of the NHS? I don't know. What does the Boris Trump axis tell me, I should say, now? Oh, it's not on the table at all. So we're all against it, right? No one admits to being in favour of the privatisation of the NHS, except perhaps, as George reminded us a moment ago, people who've written books or pamphlets calling for the NHS to be privatised, people who've taken money from very wealthy individuals who have called for the NHS to be privatised. Would they be, do you think, interested in the privatisation? Because no one is today, absolutely no one. So who can we trust when it comes to answering the question of whether or not it is, quotes, on the table, end quotes? Darren is in Chorley. Darren, what would you like to say?
Morning, my mate.
Hello, mate.
Hello, mate. Did you not think... firstly, I've just left the NHS to go and work for North West Powers, a private ambulance service provider.
Okay.
And, it's quite a change. I used to work on a medical assessment unit.
Right.
In my local hospital. I got so fed up with it, so disillusioned with it, that I decided I need a change. I'll go and work for this private firm, driving an ambulance as a patient transport service worker.
Right.
And it's probably the best move I've ever made.
Yeah, on a personal level.
On a personal level. Yeah. However, I think there's a bit of confusion here regards the privatisation of the NHS.
I'm sure
George was a fantastic contributor earlier on.
Yes,
what a smashing guy.
Just up the road from you see.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a bit of confusion.
Go on.
Because there's a difference between privatisation and service provision. Now, if the government are going to go into negotiations with it, whichever government it is, if they're going to go into negotiations with another country about providing services to our NHS, surely the main beneficiary will be the patients.
You would hope
the
so.
NHS, yeah, well, the NHS is there to serve.
But the only story to emerge so far, and I think privatisation and service provision can be the same thing if you're talking about services that are currently provided by the NHS in a way that doesn't see any money making its way towards private companies, and if they're then put out to tender to private companies and a private company wins the contract, that provision, that service provision has been privatised. So they're not mutually exclusive. My problem is this, Darren, is that the only suggestion or warning that has much meat on the bones so far is the one about pharmaceutical licensing, and the fact that in this country and in the European Union, because they are such a powerful bloc, they've been able to introduce legislation that sees a time limit on pharmaceutical licensing, which means after that time limit has expired, you can essentially sell the same drugs at a knockdown price under a different name. Now, if you extend the licensing period, the big pharmaceutical companies and, of course, their investors can continue to charge incredibly inflated prices for much longer periods of time. And I'm not doing a gotcha, mate, I promise you, but how does that help the patient?
But this is where we need to bring in stronger and better negotiators.
Yeah, I'm going to be a bit brutal here, and I'm just going to repeat the question. How does that help the patient?
The same cost or rising cost of medications does not help anybody.
I can't see anything else yet that can be realistically described as being in the sights of American negotiators.
Okay.
It's actually written down in their own negotiating objectives, mate.
Okay, so let's do it like this. You've got a small handful of service providers, be it for orthopaedic procedures, be it for anything else. And in this country, we have a small number of those service providers.
Yes.
If our market was opened up wider,
yes,
competition would be more fierce.
You would think so, yes.
So you would then.
How's that worked out for you with your energy bills and your train tickets?
My missus deals with all that.
Same here, actually. But take it from me. We pay a hell of a lot more for our energy and our train tickets in this privatised market of increased competition that you describe than a lot of other European countries do.
I think if you shop around, you can get good deals.
Yeah, possibly if you shop around, you can get good deals. But bottom line averages for season tickets and the like, we're often double what are. And don't forget that a lot of our infrastructure is owned by companies that are part owned by foreign governments. So
right, let me finish with this. Let me bring it right to the very bottom.
Yes. That's my boy.
Talking about. let me bring it right to the very bottom of what I'm talking about. For example, I'll use my line of work. Patient transport service worker in a private ambulance firm. Hospitals, my local hospital where I used to work, that I left to go and join Northwest Pals, they were getting more and more and more efficient on their discharges. Every week, every month, they were getting more efficient. That creates pressure for the NHS ambulance service.
Yes.
So as a private service provider, the ambulance service were looking to us to help them out with the increase in work.
I understand this, and
ultimately benefits the patients that are leaving.
Theoretically,
and benefits the patients that are coming in.
Theoretically,
it does.
No, hang on. See, in this context, it does. But don't forget, it wasn't that long ago that Virgin and Stagecoach, I think, and forgive me if I've got the companies wrong, tendered for a very lucrative contract on the railways. I think it was the East Coast. Put in figures that turned out to be unsustainable, so they just packed up and went home. How does that help the patients or the passengers?
You asked a question about the NHS.
I did. But privatisation is a principle that applies across many markets.
I know.
And Virgin, of course, Virgin is a company that actually has fingers in all of these pies.
Yeah, but they deal with the transportation of people. The NHS deal with the health and well-being of people.
Well, what does Virgin Healthcare deal with?
The Virgin Healthcare is a separate entity from Virgin Rail.
I'm sure it is, but, you know...
Virgin Rail
it's not as separate as it could
to
be.
the NHS.
No, I know, but Virgin is it's always hard to keep track of Virgin, actually.
Going back to what I said before, if our service providers market is opened up...
But that's why I talked about your railways and your energy, because this is what we heard when they were telling us why we'd be better off if they privatised X, Y and Z, and I can't think of any area in which we feel better off, Darren, and nor can you, or with... We have to consult Mrs. Darren to be clear on this.
I will stand by the statement that if the market is opened up, it will be fiercer competition.
Well, I'll just sit here saying, what happened to the railways and energy bills then, mate?
Well, that's a different kind of conversation.
It isn't. It's exactly the same rhetoric that was used to persuade us that would be a good idea. But anyway, more importantly, no, I am, and I'm not going to fall out with you, but more importantly, the only bit of this conversation where there's any flesh on the bones is in the context of pharmaceutical licensing, and we both know that there is no benefit to the patient whatsoever by extending our current legislation to be closer to American rules and regulations. The only people that will benefit are wealthy private investors, and that's my fear, all right? That's my fear.
I get that, but if you're talking about the NHS in its entirety, then it's not just pharmaceuticals that make the NHS.
No, but then
the service.
Imagine you're right. Imagine you're right, and there is some sunlit uplands just over the horizon. Then the fact that we're supposed to believe them when they tell us it's not on the table becomes bad news. So we're just spinning around. All of us.
You can't prove a lie until you find them out, can you?
You can't. Well, I mean, even when you found them out, Darren, in the modern context, you can't prove it. You know, it wasn't raining on Inauguration Day. He predicted Brexit in Scotland the day before it happened, when he actually arrived in Scotland the day after it happened. Alternative facts. And we, of course, have a Prime Minister who simultaneously wanted and didn't want an election. So, weirdly, what you said would have been true, or at least I'd have nodded along with it a few years ago. Now, you can prove a lie, and they'll just call it an alternative fact. And the reason why people are going along with it, for good or for ill, I always try and give people the benefit of the doubt, in a way that doesn't cast them as irredeemably thick or evil or any of those things. Some people, I suppose, are, but the massive majority of people persuaded to act against their own interests are good and decent people. If you erode trust completely, then you can create an environment in which people can believe what they want. And if you've created an environment in which people can believe that what they want, then a politician who says two immediately contradictory things, it is on the table, it's not on the table, I want an election, I don't want an election, assumes a power that the rest of us are not actually equipped to address yet. We don't know how to deal with that, you know? You always think of children. It's the only area of my life where I've ever been called upon to provide discipline. What would you do with a child who said, yes, I did hit my sister, no, I didn't hit my sister? In the same breath. How do you legislate for that kind of scenario? I still don't think we can yet. It's 10:45 already. I don't know where the time goes either. The NHS is on the table. No, it isn't. Yes, it is. That's not a conversation between two competing parties. In modern Western politics, that's a conversation in Donald Trump's head. The NHS is on the table. No, it isn't. Yes, it is. No, it isn't. Yes, it is. No, it isn't. Yes, it is. One of them is a fact, i.e. true, and one of them is an alternative fact, i.e. untrue. But whether by accident or design, we and he have created a world in which they are now afforded equal weight. The fact, i.e. the truth, and the alternative fact, i.e. the untruth. And I don't know for sure which one is the fact and which one is the alternative fact. Is it on the table or is it not on the table? I do know that various Conservative politicians have contributed to various projects designed to promote or support the privatisation of hospitals and the NHS. And I also know, the last caller in Chorley was brilliant, Darren, but I did one of those esprit d'escalier things when he went. I remembered a zinger I should have thrown into the mix, which was very simply, he painted a rosy picture, a positive picture of privatisation from a very personal, lived perspective, which we value on this programme. But I would counter by saying any money making its way into the pockets of investors in a post-privatised provision is money that could actually have been spent on provision. In his case, on another ambulance. I know that's simplistic, but I don't think it is dangerously so. So what does it mean? And who do you trust? Steve is in Potter's Bar. Steve, what would you like to say?
First of all, James, I think it's worth pointing out that your first caller, George, was right in saying that, the not-for-sale thing is an analogy to condense something extremely complex down to something that can easily be sort of communicated.
It makes a huge, complex, multifaceted, multifarious monolith sound like you're just flogging bananas, doesn't it?
It does, yeah, it does. I'm an accountant in the NHS, so I understand the mind-boggling complexity of this. But I think to unpack this, so you need to start with having a look at the way the NHS is structured in England.
Right.
You've got over 600 commissioning groups, and what they do is they pay a tariff to foundation trusts for procedures they do, and that covers their revenue spend. So I've done 10 hip operations, I'm going to get 10 hip operations worth of money. Now there's problems with that, but the capital side of it, so when they say 40 new hospitals and it's actually 6, that comes from the Department of Health.
Yes.
Now what would happen in a US trade deal is the US would say, you have to open these services up to competitive tender so we can compete against NHS Foundation Trusts or British private companies on the same level. If at the same time the Department of Health is starving NHS Foundation Trusts of funding, it's going to be very difficult for NHS providers to compete against big US companies with vast amounts of shareholder capital to back them up.
Oh, boy.
And then you get to the point where you think, well, what's stopping those companies from then doing a deal with an insurance company to say, if you want to skip ahead to the waiting list, if you want to skip ahead to the queue, you can buy this private health insurance and we'll prioritise your total knee replacement over somebody who's just, paying international insurance.
So the plebs will still be getting their healthcare free at the point of care, just a lot later than the non-plebs, under the same NHS umbrella.
Yeah, I mean, there are charitable institutions in America which have a sort of level of care is much lower. You can still access it, but at the end of the day, your money determines your health outcomes. And to some extent, that's what happens in Britain. In some cities, in the poorest areas, you've got 11-year lower life expectancy than the richest parts of the city.
We discussed this at length yesterday, actually, and the conversation with Kent headmaster in Thanet has been picked up by a lot of the local media, and I'm still reeling from some of the stuff he told me, but I'm now reeling from the stuff you're telling me, because I don't know if anyone's ever told you this before, and don't take offence, but it's not a gift I ordinarily associate with accountants. But you have explained a really complicated issue with a clarity that I have never encountered before. So the real problem, and you're working on the provision that it will in some sense be on the table, is that if you're asking a cash-strapped NHS to somehow go toe-to-toe with lavishly funded private interests from America in chasing the same rabbits, they're hobbled from the start.
Yeah, the other thing which your previous caller, his name was, missed out on.
Darren.
Yeah, that's it. You've got you've got a in terms staffing availability. So in Britain and all over the world, there's a massive shortage of health professionals.
Is that? It is all over the world, is it? I didn't know that.
Yeah, it is. But, in Britain, it's worse in rural areas compared to urban areas, which, seems obvious.
Because it's a question of where health professionals want to live and work, in simplest terms.
Exactly. Yeah. So if you live in a rural area, your costs go up because you rely quite a lot on agency staff, which are employed by private companies and cost more.
Right.
Now, if you've got American companies or, any sort of private companies tendering for services, and they can afford to recruit nationally, whereas an NHS Foundation Trust based in Yorkshire or, in Wimbledon, in London or somewhere can only recruit locally, they'll be in a position where they can shift staff about, which means that they'll be able to they'll be able to do things which are not in the gift of local foundation trusts. And this will be another issue with it as well. So, when he says, I moved to a private sector organisation, that's exactly what happens. So the NHS pay for, training, they get the staff up to a certain level, and then they leave and go to these private companies.
So we pay for the training and we don't get any of the profits from the private company. So Darren didn't say anything wrong when he described his personal terms and conditions feeling improved, but as a national interest, it's very bad news.
Yeah, so on a micro level, it made sense for him to do that, but on a macro level, it means that we're paying for things that we're not necessarily seeing the benefit of. And then he's going to work for a private provider, and ultimately there is inefficiencies there from a taxpayer's point of view.
Because they haven't paid for him to be trained. They haven't paid for him to be trained.
Yeah. Exactly.
Wow, you're really scaring me. I think you're scaring me because you sound so matter-of-fact, actually, and you've managed to cut through all of the cant and the rhetoric.
This isn't anything new. This has been going on for years.
Yes.
So if you look at the way the NHS is structured in Wales and Scotland, it's completely different. They get their money directly from Scottish or Welsh government, and they're divided up into regional health boards that do both the commissioning and the providing of their own services. There's some things like ambulances and cancer treatment, which they outsource to a trust, which is NHS provided, but overall they keep most of their things in-house, and it's a structure that's based on collaboration, not competition.
And patient care, not profit.
Yeah. But in England, you've got a situation where you've got a provider-commissioner split, and there are advantages to that system.
Sure.
There are advantages, but at the end of the day, as a corporate structure, it makes it very easy to privatise it compared to the sort of structures you see in Wales and Scotland.
Good grief.
When they say, the NHS is for sale, it's not about selling NHS assets, as your previous caller George says. It's about creating a metaphor that can cut through a media narrative that people will understand. And that isn't. And while you could make an argument that there's something I wouldn't say dishonest, but perhaps
disingenuous
about that. That's how you do it.
Of course, it is.
That's how.
But let's not forget that everybody is insisting it's not on the table, and yet I don't really see. And I appreciate that we're reiterating the simplicity, but how could anybody who's just heard your contribution to this programme conclude that it's not on the table? I don't. Unless I've misunderstood you, it already is.
Well, never mind my contribution. How can anybody that understands policy in regards to health and NHS in England over the last 20 years not think it's on the table?
Well, and then we're back to that amazing observation of George's about how many articles and books do they have to write calling for the privatisation of the NHS before you think maybe they're in favour of the privatisation of the NHS.
I mean, the Tory party are people that, their economic religion is that to solve everything.
We're just losing the line there. I'm going to suggest, you probably suggest that the market will solve everything. Seems to be the economic credo, despite all the evidence in the world to the contrary. Steve, that is one of the most enjoyable calls I've ever taken in one sense. In another sense, it's one of the most depressing calls that I can ever remember taking, because you make me wonder whether it's already too late to change course. Are you still there?
I am still there. It's never too late to change course.
That's my man. It's never too late to change course.
But one criticism I would have of the Labour Party and the media in general is they're not doing to say, this is what we mean by not for sale.
Bingo. So there is scant on detail. I'm just watching the clock, mate. Yeah. I'm going to hit the news, but there is scant on detail when opposing it, as the other lot are scant on detail when denying that it needs to be opposed. I think we've got that right. Steve, I hope this doesn't sound patronising, and you may already have done this several times, and given that the crescendo is rising in the background, you're not going to be able to reply to me anyway. But if you could write that down in a way that is half as clear as how you've just managed to articulate it all off the cuff, I genuinely think you'd be doing a national service. A national service, not a national health service, wherein he works, if you're just joining as an accountant, which is why some mornings, I know it's a little bit pompous perhaps, but some mornings when I say I'd really like to confine the conversation to people with a personal perspective on the issues. We haven't taken a lot of calls this hour, and I apologise to everybody on the switchboard. I think you probably now know why. Funny, isn't it? It's just sort of one step back from the question that everybody else is asking, and you get to the question that you should really be trying to answer. Is the NHS on or off the table? Don't know, really. Donald Trump says it is, and Donald Trump says it isn't. Dominic Raab says it isn't, but he wrote a book saying that it should be. Matthew Hancock says it isn't, but he took 32 grand off a fella that runs a think tank stroke educational charity that routinely says it would be good if it was. And he pays your money, takes your chances, I suppose. But the question we should be asking is, what does that actually mean? And it's very hard, given the contribution so far, it's very hard to know whether or not the the analysis that most of us are receiving is even vaguely accurate, because I can't currently see how it could be kept off the table. Well, I'm not going to use the phrase showing a bit of leg again, because it has been pointed out to me that it's a little bit of everyday sexism involved in that, even though it's a well-established figure of speech. And because I'm not a massive gammon, I won't now be pretending to be outraged at a very simple and straightforward change to my vocabulary. See? Easy. Theo Usherwood is... I mean, I'd like to say at NATO, but, I mean, really, he's just in Watford. What's going on, Theo?
That's a lie, James O'Brien. I'm at the NATO summit. I'm in a tent with all the other journalists waiting to speak to you.
In Watford?
Now, it is true to say... No, it's at the Grove Hotel.
Yeah, near
I actually turned up at the wrong place. No.
I've been there. That's where the England football team play golf when they're having their training sessions.
It's a nice course. I've looked out the window.
Yeah, it's a lovely hotel. But anyway, we digress slightly.
We digress. James, have you ever done that thing where you have two groups of mates and you go out with one group of mates, but you know that there are a couple in there who don't get on with the other group of mates, and you get to, I don't know, a pub or something, and you just don't want them to meet?
Trying to keep them apart.
You want to keep them apart. Sometimes you can be really generous with your friends and you could say, OK, let's introduce everybody to everybody else. But sometimes you've got a couple of friends who you're friends with.
So you mean if, for example, I was out with a couple of my LBC colleagues and we bumped into my friends from the Revolutionary Socialist Workers' Party, then I'd be at great pains to make sure that they didn't end up at adjoining urinals?
Yes. Because it'd just be a bit awkward, wouldn't it?
Yes.
And because you wouldn't want them to know. Well, that's what happened this morning, because Boris Johnson is standing on the stage with Jens Stoltenberg, who is the Norwegian Secretary-General of NATO, and Donald Trump has to come onto the stage, he's late of course, to shake his hand and say, great to be here at the summit at the Grove Hotel. And Boris Johnson is waiting, he's doing small talk and a bit of chitter-chatter with Mr. Stoltenberg, and Donald Trump comes on. Now, usually when you see Boris Johnson and Donald Trump together, there's a real camaraderie there. They get on, pats on the back, strong handshakes. He's a great guy, you're a great guy, everybody's a great guy. That didn't happen today. Boris Johnson sort of shuffled nervously on the balls of his feet, looked at his shoes. Donald Trump walked up, shook his hand. Boris Johnson tried not to catch his eye, looked the other way. Donald Trump's looking at the camera. Jens Stoltenberg looks like a third wheel. Very awkward. Then Donald Trump goes off one way. Boris Johnson has to pat him on the back and say, that's the wrong way, you need to go the other way. And that was the only photo I think we're going to get of Boris Johnson and Donald Trump together over this 3-day visit here to the UK.
If I may interject, this is, I think you're constructing a narrative here that would be supported by the fact that I can't ever remember seeing a world leader, certainly not an American president, turn up at Downing Street and have to effectively knock on the door to get let in. There was no doorstep photo opportunity. Is this part of the analysis you are currently constructing, Theo Usherwood?
It is correct.
Well, I never.
Because usually what happens when the President of the United States turns up in the UK and goes to Downing Street, he is greeted. The beast, which is his limousine, is met personally by the Prime Minister. It happened with Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, David Cameron and Barack Obama. That's the form, because the US, we're told, is our closest ally. But this time around, it didn't happen. Donald Trump goes into Downing Street, has a private meeting away from the cameras inside Downing Street with Boris Johnson. And then today we had that very awkward moment where the two leaders shook hands, but they aren't going to do a joint press conference together. And, of course, the narrative, the truth of the situation is that Donald Trump, that alliance with Boris Johnson, that friendship with Boris Johnson, makes Boris Johnson appear more right-wing. That Boris Johnson wants to appear 8 days out from a general election when he is not just trying to win over those who have always been, who voted for Brexit back in 2016, but he's also trying to win over middle-of-the-road voters who actually voted Remain, but are so fed up with Parliament failing to get Brexit done, in Boris Johnson's view, that they're now prepared to vote Conservative.
Well, in Boris Johnson's expressed view, Boris Johnson, of course, voted twice to stop Brexit getting done.
Yes, that is correct.
Just a clarification, not a correction. I always think it's important. No. People, my mum told me off the other day for sometimes being a little bit brusque with Theo Usherwood, and I said, people are in on the joke, Mum. And she said, are you sure, son? And I said, yes. So just for the benefit of Mrs. O'Brien Senior, who celebrated her 79th birthday yesterday, you are in on the joke, Theo.
Oh, happy birthday to your dear mum, John.
I'm going to play something now that will embarrass you. I'm just sort of wondering whether or not Boris Johnson has said anything about the probity or trustworthiness of Donald Trump in the past.
I have to say, when Donald Trump says that there are parts of London that are no-go areas, I think he's betraying a quite stupefying ignorance that makes him, frankly, unfit to hold the office of President of the United States.
Well, what a difference a decade makes, or at least,
That was in 2015?
Yes, when he was mayor.
While Boris Johnson was still mayor.
And while Donald Trump was
campaigning to be the
president.
Republican nomination to be president.
But he hadn't
yet secured it.
And the other element of tape, I don't know if you've seen it, is some footage taken without their knowledge of Emmanuel Macron, Princess Anne, Boris Johnson and a couple of and the
Justin
Trudeau, whose blackface shame seems to have been conveniently forgotten by the world's media. But they all appear to be laughing at Donald Trump. So I suppose if your suggestions about Johnson's fears are correct, and there's no reason to think that they're not, he'll be hoping that Donald Trump's Twitter addiction doesn't see him stumbling across footage of some of the most powerful people in the world and Princess Anne openly mocking him.
So, yes, I have seen that footage. It was in Buckingham Palace, and Emmanuel Macron, of course, the French president, was late to that reception in Buckingham Palace because Donald Trump decided to hold an impromptu 50-minute question and answer session with journalists and Mr. Macron at the ambassador's residence, Winfield House, yesterday afternoon. What I also found just extraordinary about that press conference, that I'm not sure many people have picked up, but actually when Emmanuel Macron stood up to Donald Trump backed down.
It's really funny, this. Yes.
He backed down. He didn't front up to Emmanuel Macron, because Macron says, hang on a moment, actually the problem in Syria is that we've been committing French troops and British troops or forces, I should say, because we're not committing troops, to that fight against ISIL in alliance with Kurdish forces. And now there's an about turn because the United States has pulled out of that arrangement, and then Turkey has gone and fought those Kurdish forces, and actually that needs to be our strategic priority, is to decide what NATO's all about. And Donald Trump just sort of, he doesn't front it.
Well, I saw it in rather more...
wrong, Emmanuel.
Yes, I saw it in rather more childish terms. I saw it as European leaders repeatedly saying NATO is good, and Donald Trump responding by saying NATO is bad. European leaders saying NATO is good. Donald Trump responds by saying NATO is bad. Emmanuel Macron winks to the audience and says NATO is bad, and Donald Trump comes straight back and says NATO is good. We've all been there. We've all done this with our children, Theo.
It feels like an argument over Haribo with my son at any given evening in the Usherwood household.
And on that bombshell, Theo, stay safe. Make your way back from the hallowed environs of just outside what it is a very smart hotel, actually, and the England football team really do play golf there when they're on their sort of training weekends away. 13 minutes after 11 is the time. We're not going to move away from the NHS story just yet because it is such an important one, but my apologies to Jason in Salisbury. I'm not going to come to you yet either, mate. I know you've been on hold for this the duration of Theo's contribution. But when I see a little note saying that your daughter's life was saved by the NHS, then I'm afraid I'm not minded to try and squeeze the story into the 90 seconds remaining before the next break. So we will come to you first. Immediately after that, I absolutely pledge it. I promise, but in a real way, not in a Trumpian way. Later in the programme, I think we're going to return to the question of vigilante teachers trying to keep their pupils out of local fast food shops, because it speaks to so many truths of our time. But I also have some rather grim tidings for you. I don't know if you remember how upset I used to get about payday loan companies, partly because someone who I love very deeply ended up in their clutches, and it was a very powerful window on how they worked, and where once I would have been, like every other lazy, privileged middle-class commentator in the country, once I would have been minded to suggest that it's all about personal responsibility and you can't blame the debt company for you getting into debt, nobody held a gun to your head, and yada yada bing, yada boom, yada bar. I grew up as a result of that experience, and I realised that it's not freedom of choice or personal responsibility when the most powerful institutions or vested interests in a country spend gazillions of pounds and expend immense amounts of effort trying to persuade people, often vulnerable people, to part with money they can't afford to part with, so that the very rich investors can get even richer. And I suggested to you that those very investors who do not care about the misery and the metaphorical carnage that they cause in the lives of the people whose pockets they are picking, quotes, legally, end quotes, legally, I suggested to you where they'd go next. And I am absolutely heartbroken to tell you that I was right. There's a very strong chance that Jason in Salisbury has fallen asleep. We've had him on hold for so long. But we return now to the question of what does it mean when they say the NHS is on the table or up for sale or set to be privatised? And who do you trust when it comes to answering the question of whether it actually is or not? Jason is in Salisbury. Jason, my apologies for detaining you almost endlessly. What can you remember why you rang in?
Just about, yeah. No, it's okay. Like I said, we were driving to the hospital anyway, so it's like,
good.
Mind off the tedious drive.
Yes, that's what we're here for.
I know you've had like all the the experts and all that kind of stuff, and I probably misheard the question when I called in anyway.
That's all right,
but then I thought, well, if they did decide to go ahead with it, obviously the newspapers would probably go down the Brexit route and trying to brainwash people into thinking it's a good idea. You know, and I suppose if you had to go in hospital overnight for a simple operation, you know, a private hospital would probably be good, I suppose.
Yes.
But, you know, anything, you know, serious cancer, people with transplants, stuff like that, you know, I've looked at the private side of things. The treatment's no better, and it's, you know, the cost is astronomical.
Yeah.
And, you know, if I 100% believe you know, if it had been private, my little girl should be dead now. You know, there wouldn't have been a healthcare insurance that would have covered it, or that would have been any use.
What was wrong with her, Jason?
She got cancer. Well, she still has, technically.
How's she getting on?
She's just coming towards the end of her treatment, but like a lot of the other children with child cancer,
I mean,
you know,
I don't want to sensationalise things, and if you think that I am, then please tell me to stop. But it seems to me that there is a path here, and I think this is the path you're describing. And again, if I've got that wrong, then tell me. Where the phrase that appears in my mind at the end of the path, and we're nowhere near there yet, but I think we're both worried we might be on the path. The phrase at the end of the path is, well, if her parents can't afford to pay for cancer treatment, why should she get it? And then, of course, you get very wealthy people, and one doesn't have to go far to find very wealthy people who are prepared, for example, to malign dead children killed in the Grenfell Tower tragedy, and who also, of course, are big investors. You find yourself wondering whether it would be possible in a fictional future for rich people to say, why should I pay for that? Why should my taxes go on that child's cancer treatment if her own parents can't afford it?
Yeah, and like I said, and I don't doubt it probably will go down that route, looking at all the other, like, public things we used to have. And it is all perspective. For example, you know, one of the main drugs that children have for cancer now was developed before they put a man on the moon. You know, the last drug that was designed specifically for kids, we're talking back in the 90s.
I mean, the NHS is unique in many ways, so it wouldn't be impossible to construct a model under which we all paid. Well, not all of us, would we? Because some people wouldn't be able to afford
I mean, when we went to the NHS paid for us to go to Germany for proton therapy, which they don't do in this country yet. It might be up and running now. And a lot of the people in Germany it's all private for them. They're all paying. And they were telling us some of the horror stories.
Private, but not in the sense... Well, go on. Forgive me.
Well, basically, they had to pay for insurance, you know, and some of their hospital stays were like €50 a day, you know, and we're talking about 3, 4, 5 weeks at a time for visits. And, you know, they were saying some of them have had to give up jobs to care for the children, and it's, you know, it's horrendous. And without the NHS paying for all that, you know...
I think my friends over at joe.co.uk did some Vox Pops the other day. They just went out and asked people how much it costs to have a baby in America. I haven't got the footage or the figures in front of me, but it was kind of similar to here you go. An ambulance call out is $2,500, and childbirth can be up to $30,000. So, I mean, Germany is small beer in comparison, isn't it? Who do you trust, Jason? Because you sound very matter-of-fact about things, and that's hardly surprising given where your priorities lie in the context of big pictures. It's all about your baby girl, of course it is, and nothing focuses the mind of a parent like a poorly child. But if you were to step out of the micro, as our earlier caller Steve described it, into the macro, and here are people telling you the NHS is not in any way up for sale to America, and here are people telling you that it is, who would you trust?
I don't think it would go down the route of being sold to America, but I definitely think it'll at some point go down the route of being privatised. You know, it's one of the few things we've got left that
that's the point, isn't it? It's one of the few things we've got left. This is the bit that I can't quite get past. And
people who don't use it that often don't realise how you know, it's getting rid of it would be, you know...
We're back to Joni Mitchell, Jace. We're back to Joni Mitchell. You don't know what you've got till it's gone.
Well, the last time I spoke to you, probably about 10 years ago now, my first wife, she was going through, like, liver transplants and stuff, and we looked into private. That was the first thing we did, and we found out that the treatment that they received is no better than the NHS.
You can just speed things up a bit if you've got a few quid, I think, generally, or you get room service in your hospital room and 40 channels on your telly, but you don't actually get any superior medical treatment.
It's no better. So all these people, it's just I want to get as best out there to people who might think, well, you know, I've seen it on TV, you know, like on House. Private hospitals in America look amazing, but, you know... It won't be like that. It would be a nightmare.
Hugh Laurie, actually. Hugh Laurie would be an interesting contributor to this conversation. His namesake, Hugh Grant, seems to be rewriting the rules of celebrity engagement in politics at the moment. I'd love to know Hugh Laurie's views. He's a very, very, very clever, Cambridge-educated man. And, of course, you mentioned his big TV triumph, House. It'd be fascinating to know what he thought about the comparison between America and British medicine.
Yeah.
More power to your little girl, mate. It sounds like the direction of traffic is positive.
Well, yeah, I mean, like there's probably other listeners out there with children who've gone through the same thing, and you know, and it's
and there's a lot of love coming in for you and yours.
Basically, if I had to have insurance, for example, so there was no insurance that would have covered it anyway, you know, because obviously when they tell you, the first thing you do is, let's look at private so we can get better treatments, and you find out that, you know.
I hear you. And well, knowledge is power, and it is astonishing how little knowledge we have until it is urgent, like it was in your case. I've said it a few times on the programme, that the issues that are most important are the ones which you know nothing about until you suddenly need to know everything. But the likelihood of the likes of you and I being equipped with the knowledge we need in these sort of circumstances, while most of the media is obsessed with gender-neutral vegan roles, is pretty slim to say the least. And I'll retweet that clip from Joe, the media company. But oddly, and my pals over there are going to be absolutely delighted about this, I'm going to retweet it from the account of Bernie Sanders, the former and indeed future American presidential campaign. A simple question. Well, this is what Bernie Sanders wrote. This is what happened when people in the UK were asked how much healthcare costs in the US. Remember, writes Bernie Sanders, that our outrageous for-profit system is not the norm in other countries. We can and we must do better. We need Medicare for all now. And if you think I exaggerate sometimes when I talk about people being persuaded to act against their own interests, you will find millions upon millions of people in America who not only voted to have their own healthcare provision diminished under Donald Trump because they believed he'd make it better, but who still resist the idea of Medicare for all. They call it socialism, you see, while paying $30,000 to give birth. I think I might chop that clip up a bit, actually, and play you some bits of it. Do you like the way I made it sound like I do any of that, or even know how to? Jason, take care. Love to your daughter, obviously, from all of us. Robert is in Newham. Robert, what made you pick up the phone?
Well, there were quite a few things that I wanted to talk about just on my own, and then obviously all these callers called in, and they've had some pretty fantastic contributions.
It's 10:26. I'm going to the news. It's 11:26. I'm going to the news at 11:30. The floor is yours.
Okay, right. So I'm a doctor that works in the NHS. So I mainly work in A&E departments. There are a couple of things where, well, there's only one thing I can think of: privatisation of services, and I think that's the key thing, is to sort of break it down into what selling our NHS means or privatising our NHS means to services. And one of the things that I think probably does have a benefit, and it's the only one I can think of. So I'm hesitant that I don't want to impose that I'm a doctor and I know everything.
That's my job.
So the only thing I can think of is when you have an emergency, you have an accident, you come into A&E and you need a scan, and you need a scan done overnight. We often don't have our own radiologists, who are the doctors who interpret scans on site. Okay, It's in the middle of the night, they might be tired, it's going to be expensive to keep them on overnight, and so sometimes we have services which are privatised, and we in other countries like Australia. The scans get sent over there. They're reported by a radiologist who is working in the daytime and should technically, you would think, would be cheaper because they're working day hours rather than unsocial hours, even though they're a private entity. And they are able to report these images. And I would think, although I don't have any evidence to back this up, that they would be giving, essentially, you could argue, better care rather than a tired radiologist that works in the middle of the night.
No, absolutely.
It's quick, it's easy, and it gets done, and there are benefits to it.
Clearly.
That's the only one I can think of.
Really? Well, that's unlikely to be a clincher, is it, in the context of US-UK trade agreements, whereas to move away from services... Yes, very good point. To move away from services to drugs, this notion of extending the licensing before you can release generic equivalents of very powerful and important drugs, there is no silver lining to that story, is there? That is all bad for British consumers, British patients.
I think so. And medicine is evidence-based. We don't really go for...
How quaint you are with your evidence-based positions.
Well, maybe it won't be that much.
It'll be the doctors next. It'll be doctors next. It'll be alternative diagnosis. Here is the actual diagnosis. Here's the alternative diagnosis. You can choose which one you like in post-truth Britain.
Someone was commenting on Dominic Raab's concept of healthcare and how there's supply and demand over drugs, as if that would affect the supply and demand of a disease, which, of course, is nonsense. Diseases don't choose
you say that, I'm sure,
how many people they affect.
I'd tweet him and ask him to respond, but he blocked me.
Well, it's going to contribute something valuable.
Make of that what you will. How are things, if you don't mind me asking? Because it seems to me that the NHS is often talked about but rarely understood. A lot of the measures I see do not make pretty reading, but you're there every day.
They're pretty difficult, pretty challenging. Things are getting, we're really into the deep of winter, and it's not even the coldest months of the year. It's going to get a little bit worse.
And what about staffing levels, actually, now that you're here?
Well, I'm actually a locum doctor, and let's just say work is abundant.
You can pick and choose. I took the words out of my mouth. Or I took the words out of your mouth. I'll let the listeners decide. Robert, thank you. Not just for the call, but,
thank you
for everything.